Hello, and welcome to the Eerie Encounters podcast, the only podcast devoted to all things creepy and unusual. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode.
Okay, so get this, listeners. We're diving deep into a mystery today, and you know how much you love those ghost stories, especially those rooted in history, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, the Fort Fisher Hermit is one of those that, you've heard whispers about, and you want to know more. Is it just a campfire story or something more?
Right.
And you sent over a YouTube video from a paranormal investigation team and an article from a coastal travel website.
Interesting.
So let's see if we can unravel this whole enigma. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really fascinating how these two sources take such different approaches.
Yeah.
One is diving right into the paranormal.
Right into it.
And the other is focusing more on the historical context.
Yeah.
It almost makes you wonder if they're even talking about the same place.
Right. Okay, so the YouTube video, it starts with these paranormal investigators, Michael and Joey.
Okay.
And they're at Fort Fisher in North Carolina.
Oh.
And they're on this quest to find the ghost of a hermit who supposedly died mysteriously in a bunker.
Interesting.
They even call him Robert. It's like they're old pals.
It is interesting that they name him so casually. You know the article, the coastalguide.com article,
Yeah.
which really goes into the history of Fort Fisher, doesn't even mention a hermit at all. It highlights a different spectral resident,
Oh,
Colonel William Lamb,
okay.
the Confederate officer who commanded the fort's defense.
Okay.
He died from injuries that he sustained during the fort's final battle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a really key figure in Fort Fisher's history.
So we have two potential ghosts,
Yeah,
but only one hermit.
right.
Nobody seems to know his real name.
Yeah.
Do you think they're maybe like latching onto a more recent story? Something that would appeal to their online audience,
It's certainly possible. You know, the hermit story could be a newer addition to the Fort Fisher lore.
Yeah, yeah.
Something that maybe gained traction online in the paranormal community.
Right.
And perhaps it's a way to add like a personal element.
Great. Right, yeah.
Everyone loves a good hermit mystery.
Exactly. Okay, so back to Michael and Joey. They're walking through the woods, heading towards this bunker, and they're really laying on the spooky atmosphere. Like you can hear the rustling leaves and the owls hooting. It's like they're in a horror movie.
Then theatricality is definitely part of their brand.
Right.
But even beneath the sound effects, they're touching on a very common theme in paranormal investigations.
What's that?
The power of place.
Oh.
Fort Fisher, with its history of battles, loss, it's steeped in this kind of energy that many believe attracts, maybe even creates paranormal activity.
Wow, that's interesting. And they keep saying that nobody knows how the hermit died, just that he was found bloody. They even suggest he might have been murdered, which just amps up the suspense even more.
It's interesting that they focus on the mystery surrounding his death. Perhaps because, the Coastal Guide article, it provides a clear account of Colonel Lamb's demise.
Okay.
Leaving no room for speculation, really.
Yeah.
The hermit, though, he represents the unknown.
Right.
The unresolved.
Yeah.
It's a blank slate onto which they can project their theories and interpretations.
Right. So they finally reach this bunker, and it's small, dark,
Okay.
and according to them, heavy with negative energy. They whip out their spirit box, claiming that it can allow them to communicate with Robert. Do these things actually work? I've always been skeptical.
Well, spirit boxes are essentially modified radios that rapidly scan through frequencies.
Okay.
And those who believe in them, their effectiveness. They say that spirits can manipulate those frequencies
Okay.
to form words and phrases.
Right.
But even within the paranormal community, there's this ongoing debate about their reliability.
So basically like trying to have a conversation through a radio tuned to static.
Exactly.
Sounds like a recipe for misinterpretations.
Right. Critics argue that what people hear through a spirit box is often pareidolia.
Pareidolia.
Pareidolia, our brains finding patterns in random noise.
Like seeing faces in clouds.
Exactly.
Or hearing voices in the wind.
Yes.
Okay.
But those who use spirit boxes, they say it's about being attuned to these subtle changes and patterns that stand out from that static.
Okay. So maybe it's like those hidden image pictures where you really have to focus.
Yes.
To see the image pop out.
It takes a certain mindset, a willingness to believe, to potentially hear those messages hidden in the noise.
Okay. All right. Let's see what Michael and Joey discover. They start calling out to Robert. asking him about how he died, and wouldn't you know it,
Yeah.
the spirit box starts spitting out random words and phrases.
So here's where things get really subjective.
Okay.
EVP analysis.
Yeah.
Or interpreting those supposed spirit voices. It's notoriously difficult. Even with audio recordings, it's challenging to filter out the background noise and isolate distinct sounds.
Yeah, I bet. They play back some of the audio, and it's mostly garbled. But there is one moment where they think they hear the name Robert.
See, and that right there is a perfect example of how confirmation bias can come into play.
Okay.
They are already looking for Robert. They're expecting to hear his name. So even a vaguely similar sound can be interpreted as confirmation.
So it's like when you're listening to a song and you think you hear like a hidden message. It's more about what your brain wants to hear
Exactly.
than what's actually there.
Precisely.
Right.
And, that's not to say that they're intentionally faking it.
Yeah.
It's more about understanding how our expectations, they can really influence our perceptions.
Yeah.
Especially when the evidence is ambiguous.
Right. Okay, so the spirit box session, it's inconclusive at best.
Yeah.
But the Coastal Guide article mentions some other creepy occurrences at Fort Fisher that are harder to just dismiss as misinterpretations.
Oh, absolutely. We're just scratching the surface of this mystery.
Oh.
There are reports of a locked door that suddenly flings open, footsteps echoing on empty walkways, and even a ghostly figure seen walking from the ocean.
What?
Yeah. It sounds like Fort Fisher is teeming with activity.
Wow. And the article mentions a paranormal investigation group called Haunted North Carolina.
All right, great.
And they visited the fort. They claimed to have seen a soldier in the woods, experienced a sudden temperature drop. They even recorded footsteps when no one was around.
Wow.
Now that's spooky.
What's interesting here is how they're using technology to try and capture evidence.
Yeah.
Temperature changes,
Right.
EMF readings, audio recordings. These are tools that attempt to add a layer of objectivity, to these subjective experiences.
Yeah, for sure. They even reported equipment malfunctions.
Yeah.
Flashlights dying, batteries draining, cameras jamming. Like something was messing with their tech.
Yeah.
That definitely adds to the creep factor.
Equipment malfunctions are definitely a common claim in paranormal investigations, often attributed to spiritual interference. But of course, there could be other explanations.
Right.
Electromagnetic fields, environmental factors, or simply faulty equipment.
Right, of course. Okay, so we've got two sources, both about Fort Fisher, but with some intriguing differences.
Right.
One focuses on the hermit and the spirit box.
Yes.
While the other highlights a different ghost and a range of spooky phenomena.
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
It really is. It really is.
And that's the beauty of this deep dive,
Yeah.
We're not just passively accepting information. We're comparing sources, questioning assumptions, piecing together a more complete picture.
I love it. And it's important to remember that we're dealing with stories, interpretations.
Yes.
Not necessarily hard facts.
Right.
But that doesn't make them any less fascinating.
Absolutely. It's the mystery that keeps us hooked. The possibility of something beyond our understanding. The thrill of the unknown. Even if we don't have definitive answers. The journey of exploration is valuable in itself.
I agree. I completely agree. So where do we go from here? We've got a haunted Civil War fort.
Right.
Mysterious hermit.
Yes.
Conflicting accounts of ghosts.
Yeah.
And some potentially unexplainable events. What's the next layer we need to peel back in this intriguing enigma?
Well, that raises a question for you.
Okay.
If we were to visit Fort Fisher ourselves, what would we be most curious to investigate or experience? Would we be searching for evidence of Robert the Hermit? Or would we be drawn to the stories of Colonel Lamb and the other reported phenomena?
That's a great question. What stands out to you as the most intriguing piece of this puzzle? What would you want to explore further?
It's fascinating. How these different narratives, the Hermit versus Colonel Lamb, speak to the way history gets layered over time. It's like an archaeological dig where each stratum, reveals a different period, a different story.
Oh, I like that analogy. So we've got Fort Fisher itself as the foundation, a place with a very real and documented history. We know it played a significant role in the Civil War.
Exactly. The Civil War battles, the casualties, the surrender, that's the bedrock. And those events, they would have been widely known, talked about, maybe even exaggerated over time, becoming part of the local lore.
Then on top of that, we get the layer of ghost stories, adding another dimension to the site's history.
Precisely. And those stories might draw on actual events like Colonel Lamb's death. But they also evolve, get embellished. They take on a life of their own. Think of it like folklore. It reflects the beliefs and fears of the people who tell and retell those tales.
And then we have this more recent layer with the paranormal investigators, adding their own interpretations and experiences to the mix. It's like they're adding their own brushstrokes to an already complex canvas.
Right. They come equipped with technology, a specific set of beliefs about the paranormal, and their own personalities, which all influence how they approach the investigation and what they ultimately find.
It makes you wonder if each generation adds its own ghosts to the story. I mean, think about it. The hermit isn't even mentioned in the historical article. Could he be a product of our time? A ghost born from internet forums and paranormal YouTube channels?
That's a really interesting point. It is certainly possible that the hermit is a more recent addition to the Fort Fisher ghost lore. Perhaps even a tulpa, being brought into existence through shared belief and storytelling.
Hold on, a tulpa. That sounds like something straight out of an X-Files episode. Are you saying that enough people focusing on the idea of a hermit at Fort Fisher could actually manifest him into existence?
Well, the concept of a tulpa is debated even within paranormal circles. But the idea that our collective thoughts and beliefs can shape reality, that's something many cultures have explored for centuries.
Okay, so we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but I'm game. So maybe the hermit is a modern ghost, a product of the digital age. But what about these other spooky occurrences in the Coastal Guide article? The door flinging open the footsteps, the ghostly figure walking from the ocean? Those seem a bit harder to explain away as just modern inventions.
You're right, and it's important to acknowledge that not everything can be easily dismissed. There are genuine, unexplained occurrences that defy easy explanations. It's possible these reports are rooted in genuine experiences, perhaps even connected to the concept of residual energy we touched on earlier.
Ah, yes, residual energy. The idea that a place can hold on to the echoes of past events, like an energetic recording.
Exactly. Instead of a conscious spirit, it's more like an imprint of intense emotions or actions left behind. Imagine those Civil War battles, the fear, the agony, the chaos. Could those powerful emotions somehow become embedded in the very fabric of Fort Fisher?
It's a chilling thought. But it would explain why people report hearing cannon fire or seeing soldiers, even though those battles ended over 150 years ago. It's like those events left an energetic stain on the place. But if it's just residual energy, a sort of recording, why would some people experience it while others don't? The YouTubers claim to have heard voices through their spirit box, but the travel article focuses more on visual apparitions and unexplained sounds.
That's one of the big mysteries surrounding residual energy. Some believe that individuals might have different levels of sensitivity to these subtle energies. Maybe it's like a radio receiver. Some people are tuned in while others aren't.
Okay, so it's not necessarily about ghosts choosing who to appear to, but about whether you're tuned in to their frequency. So the paranormal investigators, because they were actively seeking these energies, were more likely to pick up on something. Like they were priming their own receivers, so to speak.
That's one theory. It's also possible that environmental factors play a role, like the time of day weather conditions or even lunar cycles.
Why lunar cycles? You mean like full moons and stuff? I thought that was more werewolf territory.
Well, folklore and superstition often have roots in real observations, even if the connections are misconstrued. The moon's gravitational pull affects the tides, and some believe it might also subtly influence our own energy fields, making us more or less sensitive to paranormal phenomena.
That's pretty wild to think about. Okay, so even if we accept the idea of residual energy, there's still a lot of mysteries surrounding how it works and why some people seem more attuned to it than others.
Exactly, and that's part of what makes this whole field so fascinating. It pushes us to question our assumptions about the nature of reality, perception, and even consciousness. It's like science and spirituality bumping up against each other, each trying to explain the unexplainable.
So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like to leave our listener with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that history, storytelling, and personal experience are all intertwined, especially when it comes to mysteries and the paranormal. We can't separate them entirely, but what we can do is approach these topics with curiosity, critical thinking, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Beautifully said. So as we head into part 3, I'm curious to explore something we briefly touched on. The methods and technology used in paranormal investigations. We've talked about spirit boxes, EVPs, and even EMF readings. Are these tools reliable? Can they provide genuine evidence of the paranormal? Stay tuned to find out. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the whole Fort Fisher Hermit mystery. We explored a lot, haven't we? The history, the conflicting ghost stories, that idea of residual energy. But what about the tools? The tools used to actually investigate these phenomena. Can they really give us, like, solid evidence of the paranormal?
You know, that's a question that's been debated as long as people have been investigating ghosts. And the answer, like most things in this realm, it's complex, nuanced.
Well, let's start basic. We've heard about spirit boxes and EVPs, but honestly, I'm still a little fuzzy on how they actually work. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. So a spirit box, as we touched on earlier, is essentially a modified radio that rapidly scans through frequencies. The idea being that spirits can manipulate those frequencies to form words, phrases that we can then hear.
Okay, so it's kind of like a high-tech Ouija board,
Yeah.
where the spirits are spelling out messages through radio waves instead of, moving a planchette. But how reliable is that communication?
That's the debate, right? Critics argue that what we hear through a spirit box, it's often just random noise, and our brains, well, they're eager to find patterns. So we interpret it as meaningful speech, that same tendency that makes us, see faces in clouds or hear voices in the wind.
So it's all about interpretation then. What one person hears is a clear message, someone else might just think it's static.
Exactly. And that's why EVP analysis, the practice of listening to recordings for those spirit voices. It's also so subjective. You're often dealing with these faint, distorted sounds, and it's so easy for wishful thinking to color what you think you're hearing.
The YouTubers in our source material, they seemed pretty convinced they heard Robert's name through the spirit box. But even they admitted it was really hard to tell for sure.
Right, and that's a key point. Even seasoned investigators, they can be swayed by their expectations. The power of suggestion, it's strong, especially when you're already primed to believe.
Speaking of priming, what about EMF readers? They seem to be like a standard tool in almost every paranormal investigation I see.
Right. EMF readers, or electromagnetic field detectors, they measure fluctuations in those electromagnetic fields. And the theory is that spirits can manipulate these fields to, signal their presence.
So a sudden spike in that EMF reading could mean a ghost is nearby.
In theory, yes. But you have to remember, a lot of things can cause those fluctuations, from wiring in the walls to cell phone signals. It's crucial to rule out those more, mundane explanations before we jump to paranormal conclusions.
Right. Okay, so basically a lot of these tools are open to interpretation.
Yeah.
It's easy to mistake natural things for ghostly activity. But what about the other evidence mentioned in that Coastal Guide article? The door that flung open, the footsteps, that ghostly figure. Those are harder to explain away.
Those are definitely intriguing reports. And they highlight the limitations of relying solely on technology. Sometimes the most compelling evidence comes from those firsthand experiences, eyewitness accounts.
But how do we know those accounts are accurate? People can misremember things, their imaginations can get carried away, and some people just like telling a good ghost story.
True. And that's why it's important to look at the source, the context. Was the witness credible? Were there other factors at play that could explain the experience? And are there multiple accounts that support the event?
So it's like assembling a puzzle, looking for those patterns and connections that point to a plausible explanation. But what if those pieces just don't fit? What if we're left with, truly unexplainable phenomena?
Well, that's where the real mystery lies, right? And that's why we're still so fascinated by the paranormal. It pushes us to question what we think we know about reality, consciousness, and what might lie beyond our current understanding.
It's like standing on the edge of the unknown, peering into this realm that's both terrifying and exhilarating.
Exactly. And while we might not have all the answers, the search is what makes this journey so compelling.
I agree. So as we wrap up our deep dive, into the mystery of the Fort Fisher Hermit, I think we've discovered more than just a spooky story. We've explored how history and storytelling come together to create these legends, the challenges of interpreting evidence, and that tantalizing possibility of something more out there just beyond our grasp.
Fort Fisher really is a place where history and mystery collide, where those echoes of past battles mix with whispers of the unknown.
And we've learned that the tools of paranormal investigation, they're interesting, but they can't always give us those clear-cut answers. Ultimately, the mystery stays open, waiting for each of us to decide what we believe.
So as we leave you to ponder this whole enigma, I'll ask you one final question. If you visited Fort Fisher, what would you be most curious about? Would you look for the hermit? Try to capture evidence of that residual energy, or just soak in the atmosphere of a place where history whispers secrets?
It's a question that'll probably stick with you long after this deep dive ends. And who knows, maybe you'll discover your own piece of the puzzle. adding another layer to the mystery of the Fort Fisher Hermit. Happy exploring, everyone.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like and ring that bell icon so you will be notified every time we upload an episode, and always, thank you for listening to our podcast.